Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. It's been 3 years since a failed coup took place in Turkey. The events of July 15, 2016 and their aftermath in many ways marked a turning point in Ankara's political compass as diplomatic relations began to shift. One of Turkey's main frustrations was with its key ally, the United States, which has refused to extradite terrorist Fetullah Gulen, the mastermind behind the failed coup. Shamim Chowdhury looks at this and more on how Turkey's relations with its Western allies have since been tested.
Ordinary Turks risking their lives for their president and for democracy. A show of public resistance that ultimately crushed the attempted coup. But outside Turkey, the reaction was not quite so emphatic.
So I think it's inappropriate for me to comment except to say that we've heard the reports that others have heard.
Obviously, we've been monitoring the situation in Turkey very closely overnight and remain very concerned about what's been going on.
I can't comment about something that is not clear yet, so we'll have to see how it plays out.
Outright condemnation of the coup attempt only came after it became clear that it had failed. A deliberate strategy, according to some analysts.
I think opportunism is the right word to define, to grasp what was going on that night and the day after. Because, you know, if you remember those days, Turkey had some bitter relations with the West. So perhaps some circles in the West thought that that coup attempt might change the course of relations between the West and Turkey.
In the aftermath, the EU, US and others accused Turkey of being indiscriminate when it arrested tens of thousands of public workers suspected of supporting the coup's main suspect, the terror group known as Feto, something Turkey denies. This monument stands in memory of the hundreds of people who lost their lives on the night of July the 15th, 2016. Turkey says it will never allow anything like that to happen again, and that's why it took action. It insists all its measures were legal. The rebellion inflamed existing tensions between Turkey and some members of the international community, in particular the US. The two countries already disagreed over Syria and the US's alignment with the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK terror group. But things reached a crisis point after the US refused to extradite Fetullah Gulen, the leader of Feto and the prime suspect in the investigation into the coup attempt.
Bizden terörist istediği zaman biz verdiğimize göre aramızdaki ikili anlaşmanın gereği en azından bu kişi gözaltına alınmalı veya tutuklanmalıdır. Ama ne yazık ki şu ana kadar bu adım üzüntülüyüm atılmamıştır.
The events also impacted relations with some European countries. Greece says it won't send back 8 Turkish soldiers who sought asylum after being accused of plotting the coup. Germany too is home to thousands of Turkish nationals, including diplomats and soldiers, also suspected of having links to the plotters. Turkey now has started to seek out new alliances. It's recently bought the Russian S-400 missile defense system and is a strong trading partner with China. But it's unlikely that it will drift away permanently from Europe or the US.
I think a strong Turkey is very significant for NATO, and a strong democracy in Turkey is quite significant for the European Union. And Turkey feels like it was betrayed in that process. Turkey feels like it was left alone by its Western partners. And perhaps for that reason too, Turkey tried to seek some alternative channels.
The attempted overthrow of the Turkish government brought a sense of unity among its people. That solidarity was not echoed by some of its allies, and the repercussions of that are expected to be felt for years to come. Shamim Chowdhury, Straight Talk.
And to understand Turkey's fight against the Feto terror organization and the challenges it faced so far, I'm joined by Nagihan Alçı, who is a journalist at Habertürk, and Vehbi Baysan, who is a lecturer at İbn Haldun University. Joining me from Brussels, Laura Batalla, who is a political analyst and the Secretary General of European Parliament Turkey Forum. I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining me on Straight Talk. Vehbi, let me start with you. Sure. 3 years passed since the failed coup, and during that period, Turkey's relations with some of its Western allies deteriorated. So what kind of an impact July the 15th had on Turkey's relations?
Well, I think this is a perception problem. First, including countries in the European Union and at the wider scope, even United States, didn't give the necessary importance what had happened that night. It's sort of like a surreal. I mean, we don't blame them because at the beginning, even those who went to the streets just to defend their freedom and democracy, although all these, I'll give you more details on the warplanes opening fire and over 250 people got killed. And not to mention even the tanks rolled over them. I mean, the mutilated bodies. So it's surreal. And a few weeks later, for us, it was like, let's go back home. But it wasn't. I mean, Turkey has this bitter experience starting in 1960. And, 10, 11 years later, 1971. And again in 1980. But I personally thought that actually no more any military takeover would be possible in Turkey. All these international meetings I attended, I assured people and my students that that's it, this is over. But yet, 15 July, it came as a great surprise for everyone. Military, actually, they even using like those old tactics in the 1970s, 80s. First, they go to a radio to read the announcement, and as if they don't even know how many people listen to radio, and they're cutting one side of a bridge, etc. But no, it was real. It was real. I mean, it was so terrifying for us that with all that mess in the house, I lost my little girl, and then later find her hiding under a blanket from all these warplanes, the noise they're making, the explosions, and the bullets, etc. Yeah. No, it was real. Yeah, now, this should be understood better by the West, that actually what they did, brutally killing all these people and injuring hundreds, was a clear sign what would they do if they succeeded. I cannot imagine that.
We're going to talk about it. So,
terrifying.
Nagihan, what do you make of it? Has Turkey been left alone, as it claims? And do you believe that the international community just remained different to what has happened in Turkey? Because as we've seen in the package, I mean, they were quite reluctant in making appropriate statements about the events. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't want to start with the blaming part. Okay. I just want to maybe remind some numbers. Professor Baysan told that there were a lot of people who got killed on that night. Yes. It was 241 people. 51. It's a very high number, and it was 2,190 people were wounded. So the numbers are very tragic, very dramatic. So we first have to remind our Western friends that Turkey went through maybe the most horrible night in the modern Turkish history, and it was a continuation of an unclosed page, we should say. You started with saying that we have a history of coups, which started in 1960. And it's actually a very interesting story for me. I was wondering what kind of similarities we could find between the 15th of July coup attempt and those coups who were already succeeded in 1960, 1971, and 1980.
So how about, as we've just mentioned earlier, how about the indifferent stance of Western allies towards Turkey after this coup attempt?
Well, of course, there are several stories and rumors about this indifference. First of all, I would like to say that this coup attempt was actually very complicated to decipher because we are talking about Feto, which is a terrorist organization, but it's not a classical terrorist organization. So it's very difficult to say where it starts and where it ends. We still don't know today about to what extent it got infiltrated into the society. So that was well, let's be optimistic and say it was difficult to say, okay, this is a coup attempt and Turkish police force with the strength of the elected government stand against it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, but on the other hand, I mean, the US and the European side, I mean, still refer to Fetullah Gulen a cleric as well as a political figure, and that angers Turkey a lot. I just want to get an European insight now, because there was also a similar statement in the European Commission's report. I want to get back to Laura, as I said, for a European insight. So European Commission's report, Laura, also referred to the terror organization as a Gulen movement, and it was also slammed by Turkey. Why do you think the European institutions refrain to call this organization a terrorist one?
Well, I think a lot has been already said. That there's a confusion about this movement, and a lot of it's difficult to understand the complexity of the movement. And I think in that regard, there has been a lack of communication and explaining how this movement came to be very close to the current government, to become an enemy. So I think it's a matter of different perceptions and a matter of the complexity of the issue, and a lack of communication that unfortunately the dialogue hasn't been very intense in the last years, and this has created a lot of mistrust between the two sides. I think especially after the attempted coup, this mistrust has even grown bigger, and now we find each other in a situation in which we need to even talk more and engage more than we have done in the previous years in order to overcome this mistrust and lack of communication and understanding about the complexity of the internal current politics in Turkey.
So do you believe that new confidence-building measures should be taken for Turkey-EU relations, and how do you see the current stance of Turkey-EU relations?
Absolutely, we are seeing now rapprochement. It's nothing new. I mean, in the past couple of years, we've seen how the relations, bilateral relations, especially between Turkey and some European countries like the Netherlands, especially, but also Austria and Germany, have become more normalized. But this is also important to see at the EU level, regardless, I mean, of the Commission or what the European Parliament stance is, which in a way reflects the public opinion of at the EU level. It's very important, especially to have an open dialogue with the European Parliament. As you might know, after the coup attempt, the European Parliament's position on Turkey has gradually deteriorated. We came to a point where the European Parliament this year called for the formal suspension of accession talks with Turkey. And this might be a point of no return, even if at the member state level there's no political willingness to pursue this line. But there's indeed a need to create more dialogue. Some of the channels of communication that we had in the European Parliament, like the Joint Parliamentary Committee, where the Turkish parliamentarians meet with their European counterparts, have been in a deadlock for 3 years. There were no such meetings where the two counterparts could come together and discuss the challenges on both sides of the relationship. Fortunately, towards the end of the mandate, this was relaunched. So now it's possible to reconvene under this framework, and hopefully in the current mandate that just started last week, we will see more willingness to engage in a constructive relationship, to have a quality debate when it comes to EU-Turkey relations.
All right, so you say communication is needed a lot, and Turkey is also struggling to express herself to its European partners, whereas there are ongoing operations within Turkey. But Turkey also fights this Feto terror organization abroad. For decades, the Feto terror organization has systematically infiltrated Turkish state institutions, the military, police, and judiciary. Their network of educational institutions in Turkey has been shut, but there are still hundreds of schools operating around the world. These institutions are not only generating revenue for the terror group, but also serving as a source of new recruits. President Erdogan has repeatedly warned that Feto is not only a threat for Turkey, but for all the countries where it is active. One such example is Bosnia-Herzegovina, where Feto-linked schools are still operating under different names. Ömer Kaplan has more.
Just over 20 years ago, this was a place of war and tragedy. Now, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a country in recovery. But officials from both Turkey and Bosnia have warned that the Fetullah terrorist organization, or Feto, responsible for killing 251 people in the July 2016 coup attempt in Turkey, is a potential threat for the stability of Bosnia as well as the region. Semir Kaplan is a member of parliament who served as the Minister of Culture and Sports in Bosnia and Herzegovina from 2011 to 2015. He says while in office, he saw firsthand how Feto associates visited high-ranking members of parliament, the judiciary and the police.
Feto runs private schools and universities in Bosnia, and at these schools they provide free education to the children of police chiefs, judges, politicians, and so on. For example, I once visited the chief judge of Sarajevo, and there was a Feto member. This man had a senior position at a Feto-run hospital, and it was very unusual that he had such friendly relations with the chief judge. Later I found out that the judge's children were studying at Feto schools.
This school was called the Bosna Sema School and was built by the Gulen movement according to Bosnian media. But following the failed coup of July 2016 in Turkey, its name changed to the Richmond Park School. Like other Balkan countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina is home to a network of schools and businesses run by Feto. But according to Bosnian and Turkish officials, the group is rebranding its enterprises to try to disguise itself. After the failed coup, the Turkish flag outside this school came down, and in its place, the British flag went up.
After the July 15th coup attempt in Turkey, Feto started to change the names of their schools, but the school's management remained. It was the same Feto people running it, but they just had an English name in an attempt to distance themselves from the terror group.
Many students of the school are given scholarships, as well as free accommodation in the school's dormitories. Ahmet stayed in one of these dorms in late 2016. He doesn't want to reveal his identity because of concerns about himself and his family's security. He says he left after 6 months because he did not want to pledge allegiance to Feto's ideology.
I did not know much about them at the time, but they tried to slowly take control of my life by offering me a free scholarship and then a job. And then they began emotionally blackmailing me by exploiting religious values. I did not give in to them, but other students here have.
Turkey and Bosnia are close allies. The Turkish government has requested the extradition of members of the Feto terror group, but due to its complex political system, Bosnia has so far been unable to act strongly against Feto.
We will continue our close cooperation. We are just expecting some extradition of some Feto people living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we are expecting we will be just somehow handling this issue.
Turkey has repeatedly said that the threat of Feto has expanded beyond its borders, and that the governments of the countries where the terror group is active should act before it's too late. Omar Kaplan, Straight Talk, Sarajevo.
And we continue our panel with Turkey's fight against Feto schools abroad. Nagihan, what are these schools really doing? How dangerous are they?
Well, last year I looked at the numbers. Maybe it changed a little bit since then. Maybe dramatic change, I don't know. But last year the numbers were about 700 schools all around the world, and 250 of them were in Europe and the United States, and the rest in the other parts of the world. So Turkish government is strongly trying to convince different governments around the world that those schools are part of this terrorist organization. But it faces difficulties in convincing those governments. The biggest problem in front of this is that partly those schools are private schools. So some governments cannot intervene in private businesses. But some of the resistance stems from the resistance towards current Turkish politics, because many countries are actually denying the Feto truth. That's actually, I think, the biggest problem in front of Turkey's efforts. Those schools were actually elite schools. They, as we also saw now, they were having students from the most educated families in different countries. So they built a very wide network around the world. And they had close relationships with Feto elements in different countries as well. So actually their network is much more widespread than it's seen on paper. So the fight against those schools are very important. But of course these schools are very important instruments in teaching Turkish culture, Turkish language, and they are very good schools in in different countries. So those schools can be transformed to forms of other schools which might be under control.
Yeah, but what kind of a threat these schools pose to their host countries? I mean, I can understand Feto did try to overthrow the government in Turkey, but what kind of a threat they pose in the host countries?
Well,
are they going to overthrow the government?
No,
one
but
day, for example?
you know, they are promoting an ideology called Gulenism. Someone who is tried to be portrayed as a prophet, which is very, very, very dangerous. What they tried to do in Turkey was actually the first step. They wanted to go to all over the world to build a network and to conquer actually the most strategic points.
Yeah.
So they want to impose their own very dangerous ideology.
Vepi, I mean, as we saw in the piece, I mean, these schools are just rebranded and new flags are just hoisted. Do you believe host countries fail to understand the intricacy of this organizational structure, or they just don't mind? What do you think?
Well, no, that's definitely both, because first, they don't see it as a threat. Second, these are prestigious schools, and we don't have a problem with them. They cannot constitute a threat, but that's what Turkey said in the past. So how come an education and such nice Muslims would cause such a trouble? But it happened. So I think they should take this 15 July failed coup attempt very seriously. I mean, it's like 3 years passed, and they're still struggling to comprehend. I mean, all these people died. It's not a joke. And many of them are really brutally. And nobody was able to stop this F-16 warplane opening fire on innocent civilians, unarmed. So all these things happen. So I think they have to learn and get experience from Turkey. Actually, this is a bad thing. You cannot have a good coup attempt or good military takeover or bad military takeover. I think they have double standards here, because in Egypt, excuse me, they have the same problem. They don't recognize Sisi's military takeover. I think this has to change in Europeans' mind, especially the world.
So, there's also this U.S. issue, which Turkey is quite disappointed because the United States refuses to extradite Fetullah Gulen. What do you make of that, Nagihan?
Well,
I mean, what would it take for the U.S. to extradite Fetullah Gulen, let's say?
Well, Fetullah Gulen is strong because of the backing of some actors and powers inside the U.S. system. That's obvious. That's how he got all this power, how he got the control mechanism situated in the heart of the United States. So those same actors, very same actors, still trying to give a protection for him. And it's, of course, somehow he is like a weapon inside the American system. So it's in there, well, from that perspective, to control different countries' internal affairs, Fetullah Gulen might be a good tool for them to just keep in hand.
And Laura, I want to talk about the ongoing operations in Turkey and how Turkey's fight against this terror organization is seen abroad. What would you say?
Well, it's well known that Turkey has been fighting different terror groups in the past years. Even before the coup attempt, Turkey was fighting at different fronts and had a lot of terrorist attacks in its soil during 2015 and 16. I think the European Union has showed solidarity in this regard and has always supported the democratic institutions in Turkey and has supported Turkey in taking action against those serious threats. At the same time, though, there's a concern about the measures being taken after these attacks and the proportion and the nature of the measures. But there's a strong counterterrorism dialogue going on between the EU and Turkey, and these issues are discussed because also the terror threats posed to Turkey are a threat to the EU and Europe as a whole. So in that sense, there's a strong interest to continue having a discussion and overcoming these threats.
All right, Laura, thank you for joining us from Brussels, and I'm afraid we have to leave it here. I would like to thank you, Nagihan and Vehbi, for joining me on Straight Talk. Appreciate it a lot. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberker. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.